بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المنتجبين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. المال والبنون زينة الحياة الدنيا والباقيات الصالحات خير عند ربك ثوابا وخير أملا. صدق الله العلي العظيم. وصلوا على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Brothers and sisters, respected guests and friends, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
After the martyrdom of the Prophet, peace be upon him, one of the pressing issues or challenges that the community faced was how to proceed in dividing what the Prophet had left behind in terms of materials. And it was a pressing issue even though the Prophet really did not leave much behind in personal possessions. However, what he did leave behind was significant. And if you look at it in retrospect, today there are places in the world, museums that you can walk into, that claim to have one of the clothing items of the Prophet, or a strand of hair of the Prophet, or one of the sandals of the Prophet, because they understand the sentimental value that these materials hold. So even though it was not much, what the Prophet left behind in terms of materials signified something. And one of the pressing issues that we mentioned when we discussed the life of Fatimiya Zahra alayhi salam after the Prophet was the issue of the land of Fadak. We know that Fadak was a piece of land that was gifted to the Prophet, and the Prophet then immediately gifted it to Fatimiya Zahra alayhi salam. But what's more important than the actual land is, why did she stand? Why did she defend? Why did she make a claim? Was it that the Ahlul Bayt were in need of a piece of land? Was it that there was something special about it? There was a certain type of fruit or certain types of dates that they desired, that they wanted, that they fought for? Because some of us do get pretty violent when it comes to food, or a specific type of food that we want, right? When we get hungry, we get hangry, right? If you know what I mean. And so what was it, a case of that? The reason why Fatimiya Zahra alayhi salam is celebrated is that she stood for something. And this was the case with the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. They stood for something. And the way you gain admiration and respect in this life is when you stand for something. And sometimes when you stand for something, it's not the popular thing to do. It's not the cool thing to do. It's not the, what's that word that they use, lit thing to do. It's not. But you do it because it's the right thing to do. And most of the time when you see people do something significant, it doesn't fall under any other category except for it being significant, and it's the right thing to do. Sometimes you have to go against norms. You look at what the Prophet did, you look at what Imam Ali alayhi salam did, you look at what Imam Al-Hasan Al-Mujtaba did, Imam Hussein, and all the Imams that came after, and all the members of the Ahlul Bayt. When they took a stand, at that time, it wasn't the most popular thing to do. It wasn't the cool thing to do. It wasn't the common thing to do. But it was the right thing to do. And the reason they were able to do the right thing, and the reason they were able to stand for something, is because they followed principles. Now, what are principles? Principles are fundamentals that can be used as a basis or a foundation for your behavior to get you what you want out of life. And the whole idea of principles is that you stand by principles and you do not violate them. And when you take that term, principle, you find people who are principled, meaning that they live by guidelines. They live by rules. And when you live by principles, what happens? Well, one thing that happens when you live by principles is that you stop being reactive and you start to become proactive. Because principles are guidelines. So to strike an example that maybe makes more sense is sometimes, and some of you have probably been in this position, when you start a new job and your employer gives you guidelines on how to deal with customers. So when you receive a complaint, you know how to respond to that complaint. Instead of being reactive, if you've ever been in customer service and someone's gotten on the phone and they've pressed you about something, if you don't understand guidelines and if you don't understand principles, what happens? You take it personally and you respond. So you respond and you respond negatively, or you react negatively. You take it personally. But once you have guidelines, you understand that it's not personal. Those guidelines are principles. So what happens? You know how to respond positively. You know how to adjust your behavior. So that if a customer complains and then the next customer complains in the same way, and the third customer complains in the same way, now you have a set of guidelines. You have a set of rules that you can follow instead of being reactive. And what most people do not have in this world are principles. People haven't defined their principles. So if you were to ask yourself, and I don't have to ask you this question, if you were to go home today and ask yourself, what are some of the principles that I believe in? Most people probably would not have an answer. Why? Because it's really unconventional. Nobody really asks you that question of what are the principles that you believe in? What are the principles that you stand for? And our book, the Holy Quran, is a book of principles. The reason I mention that is because sometimes we assume that the Quran is going to give us everything. It's going to inform us of everything. It's going to tell us everything. But that's not the case. That's not the job of the Quran. The job of the Quran is not to tell you how to run every affair of your life. Why? Because it would have to be much more than 114 chapters. The Quran is one book with 114 chapters. I remember showing the Quran to a Christian friend and he looked at it, and if you look at the Bible is a number of books, and each one of those books has a number of chapters, and each one of those chapters has a number of verses. Whereas for the Quran, it's one book with multiple chapters which have multiple verses. And he looked at it and he said, God made it simpler the second time around, the version 2. It's just one book. You don't need multiple books. So it's one book, 114 chapters, which means that it has to be concise. And that's exactly how the Quran describes itself, that it is a book which is concise. It's to the point. But what it does, the Quran, is that it provides principles. It provides guidelines. And from those principles, you know how to extract certain rules which will guide your behavior. And this is found in the words of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. One of the Imams, he says, عَلَيْنَا إِلْقَاءِ الْأُصُولِ وَعَلَيْكُمْ بِالتَّفْرِيعِ, meaning that it's our job to give you the usul, which are the founding principles, and it's up to you to extract that and apply that to your life. So that you don't need somebody over your shoulder telling you what to do at every moment of your life, if you truly understand what principles are. So some principles we can find in the Quran. For instance, one principle is mentioned in a verse. It says, وَلَا تَجْعَلْ يَدَكَ مَغْلُولَةً إِلَىٰ عُنُقِكَ وَلَا تَبْسُطْهَا كُلَّ الْبَسْطِ فَتَقْعُدَ مَلُومًا مَحْسُورًا. And this verse is profound because it gives an illustration of how to behave moderately. When you spend, how to spend in moderation. Because some people most people, you find that they're at the end, the two opposite ends of a spectrum. So some people, they spend everything that they have. They get the paycheck on Friday. Here it's on Friday, right? They get the paycheck on Friday, and by Monday they're broke. There's nothing there. And some people, they don't spend anything to the point where, they haven't made an impact. They haven't made an effect. They don't even donate. They don't spend on themselves. They don't spend on their families. They're not generous with anybody. The Quran says, it teaches us a principle, and that principle is moderation in spending. It says, وَلَا تَجْعَلْ يَدَكَ مَغْلُولَةً إِلَىٰ عُنُقِكَ, meaning that don't keep your hand towards your neck. Have you ever seen when you try to take something away from a child, what do? They bring it towards their chest, meaning that this is mine, I don't want to give it up. You try to pull something out of their hand and they put it towards their chest. It says, do not do that, meaning don't be stingy. Don't just keep everything to yourself. And don't do the exact opposite on the extreme end. وَلَا تَبْسُطْهَا كُلَّ الْبَسْطِ, don't keep it extended all the time. And if you do, you have no one to blame except for yourself, for both situations. What that means is that you have to practice moderation. That's a principle. That's only one principle from the Quran. So what does that mean? When the Quran provides a principle, it's giving you a fundamental, a basis to act out your behavior. So the Quran isn't going to come and tell you exactly how much to spend from your paycheck. It's going to simply say, exercise moderation. It's up to you as the intelligent human being to understand and apply this principle. There are principles that you find from books that are not the Quran. You find the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are also principles. Thou shalt not cheat. Thou shalt not steal. Some of you have heard of the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule is also a principle. Treat others how you want to be treated, or do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's the Golden Rule. That's a principle. So in order to eliminate confusion and lead a balanced life, we need to live by principles. And living by principle you don't have to be a certain age to live by a principle. When we celebrate the life of Fatima Zahra alayhi salam, she lived for how long? 18 years. But she lived a life of principle. Meaning that she took the rules that she understood and she weighed every action and every decision against them. That's what it means to live by principle. Is that you have a certain set of rules and that you weigh every action or every behavior against them. So one example from the life of Fatima Zahra alayhi salam was understanding the principle of generosity. It is said that when you study the life of the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt, the members of the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, that what you found in their homes was the bare bones minimum. You didn't find luxuries. And anything that they had that was a surplus or extra, what did they do? They gave it away. They shared it with people. Because joy, true joy, comes from sharing. There's a joy that's derived from sharing that you can't derive from anywhere else. And so Fatima Zahra alayhi salam one day took her wedding dress that was prepared for her when she was to marry Imam Ali alayhi salam, and she gave it to a lady who was in need, who came to her door looking for something. There she was acting on the basis of generosity, and when the Prophet asked her and he inquired about this behavior, she responded with the verse of the Quran. لَن تَنَالُوا الْبِرَّ حَتَّى تُنْفِقُوا مِمَّا تُحِبُّونَ. That's a principle. That's a foundational principle. That you will not attain birr, which is righteousness, until you give up from that which you love the most. So once you give up something that you love the most, that's when the Quran says that you're now ready to attain righteousness, or you have attained righteousness. That's a principle. So principles are what guide our life. So when you're confused on what to do, that's why you need a set of principles. That's why you need to truly study the Quran, not just memorize. There is a lot of merit to memorizing the Quran and being able to recite it properly, and all of us should do this. Even if we were not taught this by our parents at home, you should take it as a responsibility to teach yourself how to properly recite the Quran. Memorize a few verses of the Quran. Why? Once you start memorizing the Quran and you become familiar with the words, now you understand the principles of the Quran. It's easy for you to act upon the Quran, so that when you're faced with a certain situation, you know exactly how to act. You're not confused. Why? Because you have a certain set of rules to go by. And if you study the lives of some of the most successful people, what made them successful wasn't just the money that they had. You know, a lot of the successful people, when you read about their lives and when they talk about what they want to leave behind, what is it that they want to leave behind more than anything? Is it their knowledge or their money?
Money.
Their money they want to give away. But for their children, what is it most important? If you were successful and you had a lot of money and a lot of knowledge on how to create that, what would you rather give to your children? Most likely the knowledge. I remember a few years ago when, and this became a trend with the billionaires. They made a pledge, this group, that they were going to attempt in their lifetime to give away most of their money. So people who are part of that are, you know, Bill and Melinda Gates. They're part of that. Mark Zuckerberg is a part of that. A number of notable individuals, multi-billionaires and multi-millionaires, who pledged that during their life they were going to attempt to give away most of the wealth that they had. Now, in Islam, there are rules, there are principles, there are guidelines as to how much you can leave behind for your family and how much you can leave behind if you write a wasiyah, a will, right? So if you write a will, a wasiyah, and you leave some money behind, the wasiyah is only effective up until a third of what you leave behind. So say you have the intention of building hospitals or orphanages. That is effective only up till a third. So it can't take up everything, because 2/3 of that, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran is 2/3 of that is for the inheritance. So that goes to the family. So you can't just spend everything. There's something that your family, by virtue of you being the parent, by virtue of them being the child, they are entitled to a certain amount. This is what God's rule is. This is what God's law is. And there was a lady who passed away about 10 years ago, and her husband were multi-billionaires. I maybe mentioned this story before. And after she passed away, they opened up her will, the lawyer who was going to execute the will, and they started reading off of the will. So what was to be left behind to the children, what was to be left behind for the grandchildren, what was to be left behind for this person, for that person. And mind you, this lady is a multi-billionaire, so she said, you know, most of the money I want to leave behind. And her husband had already passed away many years earlier. Her and her husband owned a chain of hotels, so they were very, very wealthy. And it's interesting because they began to break down how much and who would receive, or who would receive how much. And one of her children had passed away, but she had grandchildren. She had about 4 grandchildren. So she had written that 2 of her grandchildren shall receive something like $1 or $2 million each. The other 2 grandchildren shall receive 0, nothing. And she wrote in the will, they know the reason why. So don't feel bad for them. They know the reason why they're not receiving anything. And what was most surprising was the biggest recipient of her generosity was her poodle, her dog, which she had written shall receive something like $12 million. And the caretaker would receive his lump sum, something that is a few $100,000, on the condition that he takes care of the poodle. And if he doesn't, he's not going to receive anything. Now, you know, in Islamic rulings, they prohibit as dear as a dog or a cat or a hamster or a scorpion may be, different animals that people have, animal isn't entitled to any inheritance, doesn't receive anything. But what's wrong with the picture is that the 2 of the grandchildren received 0. They received nothing. Now, going back, when that whole story broke of, you know, the different billionaires that said that they were going to leave their children behind with a very small amount, people went crazy. Bill Gates had said something like he's only going to leave his children from the, whatever, 80, 90, $100 billion that he has, he's only going to leave his children with something like $10 million, a small amount. And people went crazy. That why? This person has tens of billions of dollars. Why is it that he's only going to leave a small portion behind? Well, having Bill Gates as a father and watching him and learning from those principles and learning from the knowledge is worth more than $10 million. It's worth more than $100 million. Why? Because if you understand the principles of creating wealth, if you understand the foundational truths, then you can go out and you can create that wealth. Why is it that, if you study the lives of people who win the lottery, read the statistics, most of them are broke within the first few years. Why? Because they've just inherited money. And because they're not principled, they don't know how to weigh their decisions when it comes to spending money. That's why they'll spend it in the most extravagant of places. There was one time a show that I was watching, and it was following the lives of people who had won the lottery. What did they do after they won the lottery? And there was one couple in particular, an elderly couple, which they said that, after many years, a few years had passed, they said that we wish we had never won the lottery. It was the biggest curse that entered our lives. Because all of a sudden we had all this cash, and we had these family members pop out from behind the bushes. When you have something that people want, you have these family members pop out from behind the bushes. They have proof that they're related to you. They have the blood test and everything. And they began to give money away because they have good hearts, but they don't have foundational principles. They didn't earn any of that. They didn't know how to create any of that. And so they said they began to give to one of their granddaughters. And the granddaughter went out and she experienced life. And she began to associate with the wrong circles. She began to go to parties left and right, drinking, drugs, until all of a sudden she overdosed and she killed herself. And they said that money that we received was the biggest curse. Because if we didn't receive it and we didn't give it away like that easily, that would never have happened. So understanding principles, life is about principles. If you want success, you have to follow principles. And it's not only about money. Principles when it comes to how to spend your money. Principles when it comes to how to deal with people. Principles when it comes to your spiritual life, your relationship, your vertical alignment with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your horizontal alignment with people. So understanding principles. In fact, one of the most wealthiest people in the United States last year wrote a book called Principles, and he shares some of his principles. One of the principles that he shares, he says, you have to be able to weigh your consequences. You have to be able to weigh your decisions based on the first, second, and third order of consequence, rather than just the first order of consequence. What does that mean? Every action, every behavior has a consequence. What's a consequence? A consequence is a natural result of your behavior, a natural result of your actions. And it's summed up in the statement that if you pick up one side of the stick, you pick up the other side of the stick. Meaning that you pick up one side, naturally, you're going to feel the consequence. Now, in many actions and in many behaviors, there's more than one order of consequence. There's a first order of consequence, then there's a second order of consequence, then there's a third order of consequence. That's why he says one important principle that I've learned throughout my life, and this isn't somebody who now today he's worth $18 billion. He says, but this is a man who started his own company from the apartment that he was living in when he was 26 years old. He says that the success that I had wasn't because my parents gave me money. The success is because of principles that I learned. And he says those principles came from failures that I had. So I kept on failing, I kept on failing, but every time I failed, I got back up on my feet. I became resilient. I started fighting. I didn't just lay down on my back. And because I did that, I began to learn principles, and here are some of the principles that I want to share. So one of his principles, he says, whenever you make a decision, don't just look at the first order of consequence. Look at the second order of consequence and the third order of consequence, and then based on those orders of consequence, then make your decision. So, for instance, when we eat, if you want to maintain a healthy, balanced lifestyle, they tell you that whatever you do in the gym or, when you're working out is only 10% of it or 15% or 20% of it. Everything else is where? It's in the kitchen. It's what you eat, what you consume, because that's the fuel that you put in your body. I'm not the expert to ask about this. These are just things I've picked up. But when you eat, how do we usually base our decision? On the first order of consequence. When kids sit down at a table, and if they haven't seen a food before, what's the first thing they ask their parents? Does it taste good? It's the first thing they ask. Because they're thinking the first order of consequence, which is what? It tastes good. So, and this principle it's universal. It can be applied across the board with anything. So when it comes to spending money, when it comes to eating food, when it comes to the people that you associate with, any sort of action or behavior, you weigh the first, second, and third order of consequences. So the first order of consequence, you go to McDonald's, for instance, and you get a McFlurry. They have the McFlurry here? Okay, so the first order of consequence is what? It's McDelicious. All right, and the second order of consequence is McSugar Crash. And the third order of consequence is McUnhealthy. So the first, second, and third orders of consequence. Versus only just looking at it as it being delicious. I'm going to enjoy it. Now every once in a while it's okay. All of these principles, they allow you to guide yourself based on the outcome that you want. Now some people say it's okay, well it's not a priority. I don't want a 6-pack. I want a big, beautiful 1-pack. That's my goal. Okay, well if that's the case, then you're going to have different principles that you go by. So depending on what your outcome is in life, and this, we're piggybacking off of what I said yesterday, you have to be able to ask yourself, well, what do I want out of life? How do I derive meaning and how do I derive purpose? And for each and every person, it's going to be different. When I mentioned Viktor Frankl yesterday, what was his purpose? His purpose was 2 things. His meaning was 2 things. 2 things that he extracted the most amount of purpose in. One was his family. And so he kept imagining his wife. He didn't know where his wife was. She could have been in a different concentration camp. She could have died. They could have taken her life. He had no idea, and he had no way of telling because he was cut off from the outside world. But that's where he got his purpose and his meaning from. So what did he do when he was in the concentration camp? He imagined his wife. He imagined having conversations with her. He said, I would imagine me putting my hand on her shoulder and speaking to her. And another thing that he derived purpose was from his teaching. He was a university professor. So he imagined himself standing behind a podium, students sitting on upholstered seats. And that kept him alive, and that's what kept him going. So your principles are also based on your outcome. So if you don't want to be remembered, and if you don't want to leave a legacy behind, then forget about principles, forget about rules. Do whatever makes you feel good. Do whatever you want based on the first order of consequence. There's no need to even think about a second or third order of consequence. So you have to really ask yourself, what's the kind of life that I want to live? What's the outcome that I want? And am I willing to weigh my decisions against guidelines? Am I willing to weigh my decisions against principles? And when you do, that's how you take a stand. That's how Fatimiya Zahra alayhi salam was able to take a stand. Because she lived by principle. Because she understood that living in a humiliated manner was not a way to live. Just as I mentioned yesterday that sometimes, we talk about not being superior and not acting superior. Well, part of that is also not acting inferior. So, what do I want to stand for? The Prophet, the same thing. The Prophet could have had everything. They walked up to him, they told him when he was in Mecca, they said, look, what is it that you want, Ya Muhammad? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. What is it that you want? You want money? We'll give you money. Are you doing this for attention? We'll give you attention. Do you want women? We'll give you the most beautiful of women. What is it that you want? And what did the Prophet say? Because he was a man of principle, because he was a man of standards, because he understood how great the outcome was and how great the mission was, what did he say? He said, if they give me the sun and the moon in my hands, meaning that if they gave me everything, that's what it meant, not literally give me the sun and the... If they gave me everything that this world has to offer, I'm not going to give it up. Why? Because I have a cause. I have a mission, meaning that I stand for something. That's why it's so important to stand for something. And you can stand for something even if you're young. Why? Because if you don't, then you become a drifter, just like everybody else who's just drifting through life. Some people who nobody even remembers them after they pass away. They haven't done anything significant. But then you have people that are remembered 1400 years after their death, after their martyrdom. Because they stood for something. They stood for principles. They weighed their decisions against principles. And that's what you see when you study the life of Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam. So going back to that original question of, yes, there was confusion after the Prophet passed away as to how to distribute or how to divide what he had left behind. But Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam was not confused. Maybe a lot of people were confused, but she wasn't confused. Why? Because she stood by principle. She understood what it meant to stand by principle. And so she stood for what was right. And when she stood for Fadak, and just to give you a little glimpse of what the land of Fadak was a land which was inhabited by a tribe of the people of the book. And when Khaybar was taken over, after the battle of Khaybar, after the Muslims emerged victoriously from the battle of Khaybar, the people of Fadak, they conceded that land. They gave it to the Prophet as a sign of peace, as a gesture of respect and honor. They gave the Prophet the land of Fadak. It was a personal gift, if you read the narrations. It was a personal gift that they had given to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, if it had been a part of the spoils of war, the question would have been different. Because the Quran clearly says that when there's spoils of war, the spoils of war are distributed amongst the Muslims. It is distributed amongst the Muslims, and the priority for those who receive the largest portions are the ones who actually participated in the conquest or in the battle. However, Fadak did not fall into that category. It was gifted by those people to the Prophet. And the narrations tell us that as soon as it was gifted to the Prophet, Jibreel came to the Prophet and he revealed the following part of the verse: وَآتِ ذَا الْقُرْبَى حَقَّهُ, and give those of closest of kin their due, their right. And what the Prophet understood from that, who was the closest to him at that time, is Ahlul Bayt throughout his lifetime. So he took the land of Fadak and he gifted it. It was a personal gift from the Prophet. It had sentimental value. So when it was taken away, and narrations say it was usurped, it was taken away about approximately 10 days after the martyrdom of Rasulullah, it was taken away. It was seized from them. Fatima al-Zahra had to make a decision. She had to take a stand. And she stood by principle. She stood for what was right. Because her understanding of what Fadak wasn't just a piece of land. Big deal. They had a number of pieces of land, history tells us, and it wasn't about the Prophet, because they had other pieces of land that produced profit for them. It produced dates. They had workers, they had employees that were working there, that were responsible to them, that were accountable to them. So it wasn't just about money, it wasn't just about a piece of land. Fatima al-Zahra understood what the land of Fadak represented. And the reason she took a stand was because that if she let this go, then what would the message be? The first order of consequence would be, I'm just giving this up. I'm losing out on the income. But she didn't just look at the first order of consequence. She looked at the second order of consequence and the third order of consequence, which would be that if I concede to this, and if I give an inch, they will take a mile. Meaning that if I give up on this right that the Prophet had gifted us, tomorrow they will come after other rights that the Prophet had gifted us. They will come after other rights that God had gifted us and honored us with, the Ahlul Bayt. And so she took a stand, and most of you have heard the story of what took place, the dispute. And so she asked that the land of Fadak be returned to her. And the first thing that they did was, they asked her for witnesses. because she had claimed that it was a gift. They asked for witnesses. Now, here we have to take a little bit of a pause. Does it make sense to ask the daughter of the Prophet for witnesses? Especially after it was usurped from them? If you study Islamic fiqh, if you study jurisprudence, there's a principle which is referred to as qa'adatul yad. What does that mean? That simply says, or it suggests, that if something is in the possession of someone, the initial ruling is that that thing belongs to that person unless it can be proven otherwise. So for instance, if you have a pen. Now, I don't have the receipt for this pen. I didn't carry the receipt with me. I probably tossed the receipt before I even left the store. And nobody here saw me purchase the pen. But does anyone doubt that this pen belongs to me? Or that I stole this pen? No. Why? Because you saw me take it out of my pocket. It was in my possession. That rule applies to anything. When something is in someone's possession, and if I take that away from someone, it's not up to that person to prove. So if someone comes and snatches this from me, you all witnessed that this came from my pocket. Someone came and snatched this from me. Does it make sense that that person now who snatched it from me asks me for evidence that this belongs to me? No, because it was in my possession. That's exactly what happened with the land of Fadak. It was clearly under the possession of Fatimah Zahra alayhi salam. But when she asked for it back, they asked for witnesses. And when they asked for witnesses, who did she bring? She brought the most truthful people. She brought Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, her husband. And it had been enough, it would have been enough if she only brought him. But when she brought him, what did they say? They said, no, we cannot accept him as a witness to your testimony. Why? It's a conflict of interest. يَجَرُّ النَّارُ إِلَىٰ قُرْصِهِ. That's exactly what they said. He's trying to draw the benefit to himself. Ali ibn Abi Talib, who never wanted anything from anyone, who gave up everything he had, is now fighting over a piece of land. Does this truly fall in line with the character of Fatima and Ali alayhimus salam? See, one principle that we are taught from the hadith, one godly principle that we're taught from the hadith, is يَرْضَى اللَّهُ لِرِضَى فَاطِمَةَ وَيَغْضَبُ لِغَضَبِهَا. That God is pleased and satisfied when Fatima is satisfied. And God is angered when Fatima is angered. That's a principle. That's a godly principle which is authentic and it cannot be disputed. So does it make sense for someone whose satisfaction is equal to the satisfaction of God to fight over just a piece of land? So she brought that claim, they falsified that claim that it was a gift. She said inheritance. What was the response? A hadith that nobody had heard. نَحْنُ مَعَاشِرُ الْأَنْبِيَاءِ لَا نُوَرِّثُ. He said, Abu Bakr said that I heard the Prophet say, it's as if the Prophet had confined to him and only him. And the people, the household of the Prophet did not know of this, but he knew of this. The people that the Prophet had spent his entire life with, they didn't know of this, but he did know of this. Does that make any sense? It's completely ridiculous. So that claim was inheritance. His response was that no, the prophets do not leave behind any inheritance. Even though that claim is antithetical to the Quran, because what does the Quran say? وَوَرِثَ سُلَيْمَانَ دَاوُودَ. That Sulaiman took inheritance from his father. In another verse, يَرِثُنِي وَيَرِثُ مِنْ آلِ يَعْقُوبَ. That the prophets do inherit from one another. At the end of the day, Fatimah Zahra alayhi salam left. Even though she did not get what she wanted in terms of material, she was honored because she took a stand, because she stood by principle, because at the end of the day she understood that Fadak was not just about a piece of land. Fadak was a much bigger message. And many years later what happens, because this land is disputed, because during the time of the second Khalifa, they attempt to return it to its rightful owners, and then during the time of the third Khalifa it's taken away, and then during the time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz it's given back, and then during the time of the Khulafa that came after it's taken away, and during the time of Ma'mun it's given back, and during the time of Al-Mu'tasim it's taken away, and during the time of... It kept going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. One narration tells us that during the life of the seventh Imam, Al-Imam Musa Al-Kadhim alayhi salam, The Khalifa of the time came up to him and he said, this land of Fadak is being disputed. So just solve it for us. I will give you a paper and I'll give you a pen and just draw out the borders of the land of Fadak. Nobody knows more than you do. So draw it out for us. Draw out the borders of the land of Fadak and finally I can give it back to you. Just, let's solve this once and for all. The Imam was reluctant. He said, if I do draw the borders, will you truly give it back to us? He says, yes. He says, will you truly give it back to us? He says, yes, I will. So the Imam begins to draw. And the Imam does not claim what is not his. So the Imam begins to draw the boundaries of the entire Islamic empire at the time. He looks at it, the Khalifa looks at it. He says, I told you to draw the boundaries of the land of Fadak. You drew out the entire boundary of the Islamic empire. Everything that we've built for the past few decades and our predecessors built and conquered, all of this land. If I give this to you, what's going to stay for us? He says exactly that. He says this is what Fadak is. Fadak is not just a piece of land. Fadak stands for everything that the Muslims own. All of the honor and glory and the dignity that the Muslims stand for. And so you begin to see this from a different light, that Fatima al-Zahra wasn't just fighting for a piece of land. She knew what was to come. She understood the gravity. She understood the magnitude and the sentimental value that carried. And the reason she was able to see and argue in that way was because she was a woman of principle. She was a woman of character. She understood the first, second, and third order of consequence. Anyways, that was taken away from Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam. And she had ordered after the attack on the home that nobody enter. Ibn Kathir, who is a student of Ibn Taymiyyah, he says, so what? He says, so what if that happened? Fatima was just a woman. So what if she was angered? So what if she ordered that those people, Fulan and Fulan, do not visit her? She was just a woman. She was just a woman. But the Prophet says, يَرْضَى اللَّهُ لِرِضَى فَاطِمَةٍ وَيَغْضَبُ لِغَضَبِهَا. So either she's just a woman and her emotions and her feelings don't matter, according to Ibn Kathir, or according to the Prophet, God is satisfied with her satisfaction and angered by her anger. So which one is right? Either Ibn Kathir is right and the Prophet is wrong, or the Prophet is right and Ibn Kathir is wrong.